Lucia had never seen a room so beautiful in her entire life. The chandeliers hanging from the ceiling looked like frozen waterfalls made of crystal. The walls were painted gold, and everywhere she looked, there were people dressed in clothes that probably cost more than her entire house back home. She stood near the entrance, afraid to move, afraid to touch anything, afraid to even breathe too loud. She didn't belong here. She knew it. Everyone in this room knew it too. Her cousin Rosa had somehow gotten 2 tickets to this charity gala in Vienna. It was the kind of event that appeared in magazines. The kind where famous people showed up, and photographers waited outside. Rosa had begged her to come. "When will you ever get another chance like this?" she had said. "You've never left Argentina. You've never seen Europe. Just come with me. It will be fun." Fun. Lucia almost laughed at that word now, standing in this giant ballroom surrounded by strangers who spoke languages she didn't understand. Wearing a dress she had borrowed from Rosa's closet, she felt anything but fun. She felt small, invisible, like a speck of dust that had somehow floated into a palace. But there was one reason she had said yes to this trip. One reason that made her heart beat faster, even now, despite all her nervousness. Tonight, the legendary pianist and conductor Leopold Hartmann was going to perform. Lucia had grown up listening to his recordings. Back in her small town outside Buenos Aires, there wasn't much to do. Her family didn't have money for vacations or fancy toys, but they had one thing that made their home special. They had an old piano. It had belonged to her grandmother. The wood was scratched, and some of the keys stuck if you pressed them too hard. But to Lucia, it was the most precious thing in the world. Her grandmother had taught her to play on that piano. Every evening after dinner, the two of them would sit together on the creaky bench, and her grandmother would guide her small fingers across the keys. "Music is not about being perfect," her grandmother used to say. "It's about being honest. When you play, you tell the truth. You share your heart." Those evenings were the happiest memories of Lucia's childhood. Even after her grandmother passed away 5 years ago, Lucia kept playing. The piano was her connection to the woman who had believed in her when no one else did. She had never taken a formal lesson. She had never attended a music school. She couldn't afford it. Instead, she learned by listening. She would play recordings of the great pianists and try to copy what she heard. She would close her eyes and let her fingers find the notes on their own. Sometimes, she played for hours without stopping, losing herself completely in the music. Leopold Hartmann was one of the pianists she had listened to the most. His recordings had been her teachers. She had memorized every detail of his playing, every pause, every breath between the notes. And now, in just a few minutes, she was going to see him perform live. The thought made her dizzy. Rosa appeared beside her with 2 glasses of champagne. "Here," she said, handing one to Lucia. "You look like you're about to faint. Relax. No one is looking at you." Lucia took the glass but didn't drink. "I feel like everyone is looking at me." Rosa laughed. "Trust me, these people are too busy looking at themselves." She nodded toward a group of women nearby who were admiring each other's jewelry. "See? They don't even know we exist." That should have made Lucia feel better. But it didn't. She looked down at her borrowed dress. It was pretty. A deep blue color that Rosa said matched her eyes. But it wasn't designer. It wasn't expensive. Anyone who looked closely would know she didn't belong. "Stop worrying," Rosa said, reading her mind. "Tonight is about enjoying yourself." When was the last time you did something just for you? Lucia couldn't remember. Back home, she worked 6 days a week at a small bakery. She woke up before sunrise to knead dough and didn't finish until her arms ached. The money wasn't much, but it helped her mother pay the bills. There was never time for anything else. There was never time for dreams. But tonight, for just a few hours, she wanted to forget all of that. She wanted to stand in this beautiful room and listen to beautiful music and pretend that she was part of this world. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the crowd. Lucia's heart jumped. This was it. A man walked onto the small stage at the far end of the ballroom. He was tall, with silver hair swept back from his forehead and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He moved with the kind of confidence that came from decades of being the best at what he did. He didn't smile, he didn't wave. He simply sat down at the grand piano as if he owned it. As if he owned the entire room. Leopold Hartmann. Lucia forgot how to breathe. He placed his hands on the keys, paused for a moment, and then began to play. The music filled the room like water filling a glass. It started soft and gentle, almost like a whisper. Then it grew stronger, building and building until it seemed to shake the walls. Lucia stood frozen, her champagne glass forgotten in her hand, her eyes locked on the man at the piano. She had heard these pieces 1,000 times on her old recordings, but hearing them live was something else entirely. It was like the difference between looking at a photograph of the ocean and actually standing in the waves. The music didn't just reach her ears, it reached her soul. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about those evenings in the small living room, the candlelight flickering when the power went out, her grandmother's gentle voice saying, "Feel the music, Lucia. Don't just play it. Feel it." Tears formed in her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. She didn't care if anyone saw. The performance lasted almost an hour. But to Lucia, it felt like minutes. When Hartmann finally lifted his hands from the keys, the room exploded in applause. People stood up from their seats. Some shouted, "Bravo!" Others dabbed at their eyes with expensive handkerchiefs. Lucia clapped until her palms hurt. She had never experienced anything like this. She had never felt so alive. Rosa leaned over and whispered, "Worth the trip?" Lucia nodded, unable to speak, but the night wasn't over yet. As the applause died down, Hartmann stood from the piano bench and faced the crowd. There was a strange smile on his face now. Something playful, and maybe a little dangerous. "Thank you," he said, his voice deep and smooth. "But the evening is still young, and I find myself in the mood for some entertainment." The guests murmured with curiosity. What did he mean? Hartmann's eyes swept across the room like a spotlight. "I wonder," he said slowly, "if anyone here tonight believes they can play." A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd. No one moved. "Come now," Hartmann continued, his smile growing wider. "Surely someone in this room has touched a piano before. I promise, I won't bite." More laughter. But still, no one stepped forward. Lucia felt Rosa's hand grip her arm. "Don't even think about it," Rosa whispered, but Lucia wasn't thinking about anything. She was too busy trying to disappear into the wall behind her, praying that the famous Maestro's gaze would pass over her like it passed over everyone else. It didn't. His eyes stopped moving. They landed directly on her. "You," he said, pointing one long finger in her direction, "the young lady in the blue dress. You look like you have something to say." Every head in the room turned to look at her, and Lucia's world stopped spinning. Lucia felt like the floor had opened up beneath her feet. Every single person in that grand ballroom was now staring at her. She could feel their eyes on her skin like heat from a fire. Her face turned red. Her hands started to shake. The champagne glass she was holding trembled so badly that some of it spilled onto her borrowed dress. Rosa grabbed her elbow and whispered urgently, "Just shake your head. Say no. He'll move on to someone else." But Lucia couldn't move. She couldn't speak. She was frozen, like a rabbit caught in headlights. Leopold Hartmann was still looking at her. That playful smile was still on his face. But there was something else in his eyes now. Curiosity, maybe. Or amusement. He was enjoying this. "Don't be shy," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the silent room. "I saw you during my performance. You weren't just listening. You were feeling every note. That tells me something." A few guests turned to look at her with new interest. Others whispered to each other behind their hands. Lucia wanted to sink into the floor and disappear forever. I'm not," she started to say, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. "What was that?" Hartmann tilted his head. You'll have to speak up, my dear. These old ears aren't what they used to be. Soft laughter rippled through the crowd. They were enjoying this too. To them, this was entertainment. A bit of fun before they went back to their champagne and their conversations about money and politics. They didn't care that Lucia's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. She doesn't play, Rosa said loudly, stepping slightly in front of her cousin. She's just here as a guest. Please. Pick someone else. Hartman raised an eyebrow. Is that so? He looked past Rosa, directly at Lucia. Is that true? You don't play? Lucia opened her mouth to agree. To lie. To say whatever would make this moment end. But the words wouldn't come, because the truth was, she did play. She had been playing her whole life. The piano was the only thing that had ever made sense to her. The only place where she felt like herself, and standing here in this room, being called out by the greatest pianist she had ever heard. Something inside her refused to deny it. I play a little, she heard herself say. Rosa shot her a look of pure panic. Lucia, what are you doing? But it was too late. Hartman's smile widened. A little, he repeated. Well then, a little is all we need. He gestured toward the grand piano like a king, offering his throne. Please, come, show us. The crowd parted to make way for her. It felt like walking through a tunnel made of silk and diamonds and judgment. Every step felt heavier than the last. Lucia could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, loud and fast and terrified. What was she doing? This was insane. She was a baker from a small town in Argentina. She had never performed in front of anyone except her grandmother, and now she was supposed to sit down at a grand piano in Vienna and play for a room full of millionaires and celebrities? She reached the stage and stopped. The piano was even more beautiful up close. It was enormous and black and shining, like a sleeping animal made of polished night. The keys were perfect, white and black, waiting for someone to bring them to life. Hartman was standing beside it, watching her with those sharp eyes. Up close, he was even more intimidating. His presence filled the space around him like he was made of something heavier than ordinary people. Nervous? He asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Lucia nodded. There was no point in lying. Good, he said. Nerves mean you care. Only fools feel nothing before they perform. She wasn't sure if that was meant to be comforting or not. It didn't matter. Her legs carried her forward until she was standing in front of the piano bench. Sit, Hartman said. Take your time. When you're ready, play whatever you like. Impress me. Impress him. Impress Leopold Hartman. The man whose recordings she had memorized. The man whose playing had made her cry just minutes ago. The man who had performed for presidents and queens. This had to be a joke. This had to be some kind of cruel test. Lucia sat down on the bench. The leather was cool and smooth beneath her. She placed her hands in her lap and stared at the keys. They stared back at her. Silent and waiting. The room was completely quiet now. No one was whispering anymore. No one was drinking or laughing. Everyone was watching her, waiting to see what would happen next. She thought about running. She could stand up right now, apologize, and walk out of this ballroom. She could find a taxi and go back to the hotel and pretend this night never happened. No one would stop her. No one would care. Tomorrow, these rich people would forget she ever existed. But then she thought about her grandmother. She thought about those nights in the small living room, the candles flickering because they couldn't afford electricity, her grandmother's wrinkled hands guiding hers across the keys. She thought about the way her grandmother used to close her eyes when Lucia played, a small smile on her face, like she was seeing something beautiful that no one else could see. You have a gift, her grandmother had told her once. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small because of where you come from. Music doesn't care about money or fancy schools. Music only cares about truth. Lucia took a deep breath. Then another. She felt her heartbeat start to slow. Just a little. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She wasn't here to compete with Leopold Hartman or prove herself to these strangers. She was here because music was part of her. It was in her blood, in her bones, in every memory she had of the woman who raised her. If she was going to play, she was going to play for her grandmother. No one else. She lifted her hands and placed them on the keys. The ivory felt familiar beneath her fingers. It didn't matter that this piano cost more than her entire neighborhood back home. It didn't matter that it was in Vienna instead of Argentina. A piano was a piano. And she knew pianos. She closed her eyes. The room disappeared. The people disappeared. The fear disappeared. There was only the darkness behind her eyelids, and the cool smoothness of the keys, and the music waiting inside her, ready to come out. She thought about what to play. Her mind went through dozens of pieces, all the songs she had taught herself over the years. Beethoven, Mozart, Bach, Debussy. She knew them all. She had played them so many times that they were part of her now, like memories of her own life. But one piece kept coming back to her. One piece that meant more to her than any other. Chopin's ballad, No One. It was the first piece her grandmother had ever played for her. Lucia had been just 5 years old. Sitting on the floor of the living room, watching her grandmother's hands move across the old piano like birds in flight. She hadn't understood the music then, not really. But she had felt it. She had felt the sadness and the hope and the longing all mixed together into something that made her chest ache in a way she couldn't explain. Years later, she had learned to play it herself. It had taken her months to master. There were nights when she wanted to give up, when her fingers cramped and her back hurt and the notes just wouldn't come out right. But she kept going. She kept practicing. Because every time she played that piece, she felt her grandmother beside her again. Now, in this golden ballroom in Vienna, surrounded by strangers who expected her to fail, she was going to play it one more time. For her grandmother, for herself, for the little girl who used to sit on the floor and dream about music. Lucia pressed down on the first key, and the room held its breath. The first note floated into the air like a single drop of rain falling into a still pond. It was soft, gentle, almost hesitant. The kind of note that could disappear if you weren't paying attention. But everyone was paying attention. Lucia kept her eyes closed. She couldn't bear to look at the crowd, to see their faces waiting for her to fail. So she shut them out completely. She pretended she was back home in her grandmother's living room, sitting at the old piano with the scratched wood and the sticky keys. She pretended the only person listening was her grandmother, sitting in the worn armchair by the window, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. The second note came, then the third. Then a cascade of notes that tumbled over each other like water rushing down a hillside. Chopin's Ballade. No One was not an easy piece. It was long and complicated, full of sudden changes and unexpected turns. There were parts that required fingers to move faster than thought. There were parts that required a delicate touch, as light as a feather brushing across skin. Most pianists spent years perfecting it. Many never succeeded. Lucia had never performed it for anyone. She had only ever played it alone, in her small house, with no audience except the ghosts of her memories. But tonight, something was different. Maybe it was the piano. This grand instrument was nothing like her grandmother's old upright. Every key responded to the slightest touch. Every note rang out clear and pure, filling the enormous ballroom with sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Or maybe it was the moment. Maybe there was something about standing at the edge of a cliff that made you finally understand what you were capable of. Whatever it was, Lucia played like she had never played before. Her fingers moved across the keys without hesitation. They knew exactly where to go, exactly how hard to press, exactly when to lift. All those years of practice, all those nights spent hunched over the piano until her back ached and her eyes burned, all of it came together in this one moment. She didn't think about the notes. She didn't think about the technique. She just played. In the crowd, something began to shift. At first, people were curious. A young woman in a borrowed dress playing piano at a fancy gala? It was unusual. Interesting. Worth watching for a minute or two, before returning to their conversations. But a minute passed, and no one moved. 2 minutes passed, and people started glancing at each other with confused expressions. 3 minutes passed, and a woman near the front slowly lowered herself into a chair. her hand pressed against her heart. This wasn't what they had expected. They had expected clumsy fingers and missed notes. They had expected a nervous amateur stumbling through a simple melody, providing a moment of awkward entertainment before the real musicians took over again. Instead, they were hearing something extraordinary. The music filled every corner of the room. It wrapped around the crystal chandeliers and sank into the velvet curtains. It found its way into the spaces between heartbeats. People who had spent their lives surrounded by the finest art and music, who had heard orchestras perform in the greatest concert halls in the world, stood frozen in place. Because this wasn't just technical skill. This was something more. There was pain in the music. Real pain. The kind that comes from losing someone you love. The kind that never fully goes away. No matter how many years pass. Lucia played those notes, and everyone in the room felt their own losses stirring inside them. They thought of parents who had passed away, of friends they had drifted apart from, of dreams they had given up on. But there was also hope. Somewhere in the middle of all that sadness, there was a thread of light, a whisper that said, "It's going to be okay. Not today. Maybe. Not tomorrow, but someday." The music carried that promise like a river carries a leaf. Gently, steadily, toward something better. Near the back of the room, Rosa stood with her hand over her mouth. Tears were streaming down her face, and she didn't even notice. She had known Lucia her whole life. She knew her cousin played piano, but she had never heard her play like this. She had never known that this kind of beauty was living inside the quiet girl who woke up before dawn to make bread. And at the edge of the stage, Leopold Hartmann stood absolutely still. The famous Maestro had stopped smiling. The playful look in his eyes was gone. In its place was something that looked almost like shock. His arms were crossed over his chest, and his head was tilted slightly to one side, as if he was trying to understand what he was hearing. He had invited this girl to play as a joke, a bit of fun to entertain the guests. He had done it dozens of times before at events like this. Amateur musicians would sit at his piano, fumble through a few bars of some simple tune, and then retreat to polite applause and gentle laughter. It was harmless. It was amusing. It reminded everyone why professionals like him were worth their fees. But this woman was not fumbling. She was not amateur. She was playing Chopin's Ballade. One of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire, and she was playing it beautifully. No, not just beautifully. She was playing it perfectly. Hartmann had performed this piece himself many times. He knew every note, every phrase, every hidden emotion buried in the music, and as he listened to this unknown girl from God knows where, he realized something that shook him to his core. She wasn't just hitting the right notes. She was telling a story. She was pouring her entire soul into the music, holding nothing back. Every phrase carried weight. Every pause meant something. She played like someone who had lived through real struggle, real loss, real love. Not like someone who had learned music from books and teachers, but like someone who had discovered it through pain and survival. When was the last time he had played like that? When was the last time his music had carried that kind of raw, honest emotion? He couldn't remember. The piece built toward its climax. Lucia's hands flew across the keyboard, the notes coming faster and faster, crashing over each other like waves in a storm. Her body swayed with the rhythm. Her hair, which had been neatly pinned back, started to come loose. A strand fell across her face, but she didn't notice. She was somewhere else entirely. She was in the music, lost in a world that only she could see. The guests barely breathed. Some had tears on their cheeks. Others gripped the hands of the people beside them. Strangers holding on to strangers because the emotion in the room was too much to bear alone. And then came the final passage. The music slowed. The storm passed. What remained was quiet and tender, like the first light of morning after a long, dark night. Lucia's fingers moved gently now, drawing out each note, making it last as long as possible. She thought of her grandmother's smile. She thought of the way the old woman's eyes would light up whenever Lucia sat down at the piano. She thought of the last words her grandmother had spoken to her. just days before she passed away. "Promise me you'll keep playing," she had said. "Promise me you won't give up," Lucia had promised. And she had kept that promise. Even when it was hard. Even when she was tired and poor and alone. Even when no one was listening, but tonight, someone was listening. Tonight, hundreds of people were listening. And for the first time in her life, Lucia realized that her grandmother had been right all along. She did have a gift. Her fingers found the final chord. She pressed the keys slowly, letting the sound ring out into the silence of the ballroom, and then she opened her eyes. For a moment, there was nothing. Just silence. The kind of silence that feels heavier than sound. Lucia sat at the piano with her hands still resting on the keys. She was afraid to move, afraid to look up. The last echoes of the music faded into the corners of the ballroom, and what remained was a stillness so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat. Had she made a mistake? Had she embarrassed herself in front of all these people? Maybe the silence meant they were disappointed. Maybe they were waiting for her to leave so they could go back to their party and forget she had ever existed. She felt the heat rising to her cheeks. Her throat tightened. She wanted to stand up and run out of the room before anyone could see the tears forming in her eyes. But then she heard it. A single pair of hands clapping. Lucia looked up. It was an older woman near the front of the crowd. She had silver hair and wore a dark green dress covered in emeralds. Tears were streaming down her face. But she was smiling. She was clapping slowly, deliberately, like each clap was a word she was trying to say. Then another person joined in, and another, and another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted. The applause crashed over Lucia like a wave. It was loud and wild and full of emotion. People were standing up from their chairs. They were shouting things she couldn't understand. Some were crying openly, not even trying to hide it. Others were laughing with pure joy. The kind of laughter that comes when you experience something you never expected. Lucia sat frozen at the piano, unable to process what was happening. These were the same people who had looked right through her when she first walked into this room. The same people who had whispered behind their hands when the maestro pointed at her. Now they were on their feet, applauding like their lives depended on it. She turned her head and found Rosa in the crowd. Her cousin was pushing through the guests, tears running down her cheeks, her hands pressed together like she was praying. When their eyes met, Rosa mouthed two words that Lucia would never forget. "I'm sorry." Sorry for what? Sorry for underestimating her? Sorry for not knowing what she was capable of? It didn't matter. Lucia understood. She had spent her whole life being invisible, being overlooked, being the quiet girl who worked at the bakery and never complained. Even the people who loved her didn't really know her. They didn't know about the fire that burned inside her when she played. They didn't know about the dreams she had buried so deep that she had almost forgotten them herself. But now, for the first time, everyone could see. The applause went on and on. It felt like it would never stop. Lucia didn't know what to do, so she just sat there, her hands trembling in her lap, her eyes wet with tears. She couldn't hold back anymore. Then a movement caught her attention. Leopold Hartmann was walking toward her. The crowd noticed too. The applause began to fade as people watched the famous maestro approach the piano. His face was unreadable. Lucia couldn't tell if he was angry or impressed, or something else entirely. Her heart started pounding again. Harder than before. He stopped in front of her. For a long moment, he just looked at her. His eyes moved across her face like he was searching for something. The room had gone quiet again, everyone waiting to see what he would do. Lucia forced herself to meet his gaze. She had nothing to be ashamed of. She had played her best. She had played her truth. Whatever he thought of her, whatever cruel joke he was about to make, she would not look away. But then something unexpected happened. Leopold Hartmann, the legendary pianist who had performed for kings and queens, the man whose name was spoken with reverence in concert halls around the world, did something that no one in that room had ever seen him do before. He bowed. It wasn't a small nod or a polite gesture. It was a full, deep bow. The kind of bow you give to someone you respect. The kind of bow that says, I acknowledge you as my equal. Gasps rippled through the crowd. People exchanged shocked glances. This was Leopold Hartmann. He didn't bow to anyone. He was the one people bowed to. When he straightened up, there was a different look in his eyes. The arrogance was gone. The playfulness was gone. What remained was something softer. Something almost like humility. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but in the silent room, everyone could hear. "Lucia," she managed to say. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Lucia," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Where did you study?" She shook her head. "I didn't. I never went to music school." His eyebrows rose. "No conservatory? No private teachers?" "No, just my grandmother. She taught me when I was little. After she died, I taught myself." The crowd murmured. This was impossible. The piece she had just played required years of formal training. Decades of practice under expert guidance. How could someone with no education play like that? But Hartmann didn't look surprised. He looked like something had just been confirmed for him. "I have been playing piano for 53 years, he said slowly. "I have performed on every major stage in the world. I have won awards that most musicians can only dream of. And in all that time, I have heard countless pianists. Some were technically perfect, some were emotionally powerful, but very few." He paused, searching for the right words. "Very few had what you have." Lucia didn't know what to say. She wasn't even sure she understood what he meant. "What do I have?" she asked. Hartmann smiled. It was a different smile than before. Warmer, more genuine. "Truth," he said. "You play with truth. You don't hide behind technique or style. You don't try to impress. You just tell the truth. And that is the rarest gift of all." The room was so quiet that Lucia could hear her own breathing. She thought about her grandmother again. About all those evenings in the small living room, learning to play by candlelight, about the words her grandmother had repeated over and over. Music is not about being perfect. It's about being honest. Her grandmother had known. All along, she had known. Hartmann extended his hand toward her. "Please," he said. "Stand up." Lucia rose from the piano bench on shaky legs. She took his hand, and he turned her to face the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice ringing through the ballroom, "I owe all of you an apology. I invited this young woman to play as a joke. A bit of entertainment. I expected her to stumble through a few notes, so we could all have a gentle laugh and move on with our evening." He paused. The guests hung on every word. "Instead, she has reminded me of something I had forgotten, something that all of us, in our busy lives full of schedules and deadlines and responsibilities, tend to forget." He looked at Lucia, and his eyes were shining. "She has reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place." The applause started again. But this time it was different. This time it came with cheers and whistles. People were calling out her name. "Lucia! Lucia!" Like she was someone famous, like she mattered. Rosa finally reached the front of the crowd. She threw her arms around her cousin and held her tight, both of them crying now, laughing and crying at the same time. "I can't believe it," Rosa kept saying. "I can't believe it. Lucia, you were incredible. You were absolutely incredible." But Lucia barely heard her. She was looking out at the sea of faces. All these strangers who had witnessed the most important moment of her life. She was thinking about how strange the world was, how you could wake up one morning as nobody, as a baker from a small town, and go to sleep that same night as someone different, someone who had been seen, someone who had been heard. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if this night would change anything, or if she would go back to her old life and her old routines like nothing had ever happened. But right now, in this moment, none of that mattered. Right now, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The rest of that night passed in a blur. People kept coming up to Lucia, shaking her hand, asking for her name, pressing business cards into her palm. She smiled and nodded and said thank you so many times that the words stopped feeling real. Rosa stayed by her side the whole time, acting like a bodyguard, pulling her away whenever someone got too pushy. By the time they finally made it back to their small hotel room, Lucia's feet ached and her head was spinning. She sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing her borrowed blue dress, and stared at the pile of business cards on the nightstand. "Do you understand what just happened?" Rosa asked, pacing back and forth across the tiny room. "Do you have any idea? Those weren't just random people, Lucia. I saw the head of the Vienna Philharmonic in that crowd. I saw music producers. I saw people who run some of the biggest concert halls in Europe." Lucia shook her head slowly. "It doesn't feel real." "Well, it is real." Rosa grabbed the business cards and fanned them out like a deck of playing cards. "Look at these. These people want to talk to you. They want to hear you play again. This could change everything." But Lucia wasn't looking at the cards. She was looking at her hands. The same hands that kneaded bread every morning at the bakery. The same hands that had learned to play piano on her grandmother's old upright. They looked the same as always. Nothing about them had changed. And yet, everything had changed. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the evening in her mind. The terror of walking toward the piano, the feeling of the keys beneath her fingers, the silence of the crowd. And then, that wave of applause, crashing over her like nothing she had ever experienced. When morning came, she and Rosa went down to the hotel restaurant for breakfast. Lucia was exhausted, her eyes red from lack of sleep. She just wanted a cup of coffee, and maybe a piece of toast. She wasn't prepared for what happened next. A man was waiting for them in the lobby. He was tall and thin, with round glasses and a serious expression. He introduced himself as an assistant to Leopold Hartmann. "The Maestro would like to see you," he said. "He has a proposal." Lucia's heart stopped. "A proposal?" "He didn't share the details with me. But he was very insistent that I find you this morning." The man handed her a card with an address written on it. "He'll be expecting you at noon." Rosa grabbed Lucia's arm so hard it almost hurt. "We'll be there," she said before Lucia could respond. At noon, they arrived at a beautiful old building in the center of Vienna. The assistant led them up a winding staircase to a private studio filled with instruments and books and photographs of famous musicians. And there, sitting at a grand piano identical to the one from the gala, was Leopold Hartmann. He looked different in the daylight. Smaller, somehow, more human. The fierce presence from the night before had softened. When he saw Lucia, he stood up and smiled. "You came," he said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Lucia admitted. "I thought maybe last night was a dream." Hartmann laughed. It was a warm sound, nothing like the sharp, teasing laughter from the gala. "I assure you, it was very real. I haven't stopped thinking about it since." He gestured toward a chair. "Please, sit. Both of you." They sat. Lucia's hands were shaking again, so she pressed them against her knees to keep them still. Hartmann studied her for a long moment. Then he spoke. "I have been teaching master classes for over 30 years, he said. "I have worked with the most talented young pianists in the world. Students from Juilliard, from the Royal Academy, from conservatories in Moscow and Berlin and Tokyo. They come to me with perfect technique, perfect posture, perfect everything." He paused, and most of them bore me to tears. Lucia didn't know what to say, so she stayed silent. "They play the notes," Hartmann continued. "They play them correctly, beautifully, flawlessly. But they don't say anything. There's no story, no soul. They've been trained so thoroughly that they've forgotten how to feel." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "You are the opposite. You have no formal training. Your technique has gaps. There are things you do that would make a conservatory professor weep. But when you play, you say something. You make people feel. And that cannot be taught." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Vienna streets below. "I would like to help you," he said quietly. "I have connections in the music world. I can open doors for you that would otherwise take years to open. If they opened at all, I can introduce you to the right people, get you auditions, help you build a career." He turned to face her. "But I want to be clear about something. I'm not offering this because I feel sorry for you. I'm offering it because I believe you have a gift that the world deserves to hear." Lucia felt tears burning in her eyes. This was too much. It was all too much. "Why?" she whispered. "You don't even know me." "Why?" Hartman smiled sadly. "Because once, a very long time ago, someone did the same for me. I was a young man, from a poor family in a small town. I had talent, but no opportunities. And then one day, a famous conductor heard me play and decided to take a chance on me. He changed my life. Everything I have, everything I've accomplished, started with that one act of kindness." He walked back toward her and sat down. "It's time for me to pass that forward." 1 year later, Lucia stood backstage at Carnegie Hall in New York City. She could hear the murmur of the audience on the other side of the curtain. 2,000 people, waiting to hear her play. Critics from the biggest newspapers in the world, music lovers who had paid hundreds of dollars for their tickets, all of them here for her. It still didn't feel real. Sometimes she woke up in the middle of the night, convinced that she was back in her small room in Argentina, that all of this had been a dream. Then she would see the piano in the corner of her new apartment, the beautiful instrument that Hartman had helped her buy, and she would remember that it was all true. The past year had been the hardest of her life. Hartman hadn't been gentle with her. He had pushed her to her limits, made her practice until her fingers bled, forced her to confront every weakness in her playing. There were days when she wanted to quit, days when she missed her old life, the simple rhythm of the bakery, the smell of fresh bread in the morning. But she hadn't quit. She had kept going. Because every time she sat down at the piano, she felt her grandmother beside her. Every time she played, she heard that gentle voice in her ear. Music is not about being perfect, it's about being honest. A stagehand appeared beside her. 5 minutes, Miss Lucia. She nodded. Her hands were trembling, just like they had trembled that night in Vienna. She didn't think that would ever change. Maybe it wasn't supposed to. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small photograph. It was old and worn, the edges soft from years of handling. In it, a young girl sat at an old piano, next to an elderly woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Lucia pressed the photograph to her heart. "This is for you, Grandma," she whispered. "Everything I do is for you." Then she tucked the photograph back into her pocket, took a deep breath, and walked out onto the stage. The lights were blinding. The applause was deafening. 2,000 people rose to their feet before she had even played a single note, but Lucia didn't see any of them. She saw only the piano, waiting for her like an old friend. She walked toward it, sat down on the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. She closed her eyes, and she began to play.